shirt on that's black.
It looks fancy.
Looks
It's fancy.
It's the ruffles. The ruffles make it fancy.
It's the ruffles.
Yeah. It's it's been so cold here that it's nice to like be able to like wear short sleeves again.
I have been getting a lot of feedback that the office is cold, and
It is cold there. 70 is cold.
I'm sorry?
70 is cold.
70 is not cold. 70 is like the ideal room temperature.
No, we're living in an eternal spring there.
Isn't that what we want?
No. Can we like settle on like 72, 73?
No, that's hot.
No. Okay. I think, well, you're about to leave for 2 weeks, so your opinion really doesn't matter for the
and I'm going to the desert where it's going to be really hot.
Exactly. So actually, we should probably turn it way up so you can start acclimating quicker.
No, I think it's good. You know what the first thing Steven asked me was when he walked through the door today?
What?
He read the note and was like, why do we need a bench?
I did not put a bench. That's not my note.
Oh, that's not your note?
That's Amber's note. Yeah. No, we discussed a bench outside by the window.
Uh-huh.
I think it'd be really nice. The rug, I'm really happy with. I've tried to flatten it out all last night.
I would think as much as the rug costs that you wouldn't have to flatten it out.
Well, it's wool, and the ends kind of curl because they're rolled.
I see. The poodle didn't flatten it out?
No, the poodle did not. I have Cooper and Bailey and Birch sitting on it right now.
That's how hardcore ABA we are.
You can use those books in any aspect of your life. Do you need to know about ABA?
That is how hardcore we are.
So you excited to talk about AAC today?
I am very excited to talk about it. I've been trying to grab a couple of speech pathologists I know to jump on.
What other speech therapists are jumping on?
I don't know. I just sent them emails. Some from, I sent one down to Louisiana and one to Georgia. So it'll be interesting because we're live streaming now and we're recording. So yeah. Watch your language, Lauren.
It is not often I that has to watch my language.
You're right. Katie's not on yet. We're okay. No, it's Ted. Ted's the one.
Yeah. It's like of how many of us that would do this.
Yeah. So I'm trying to get a little special guest come on Thursday to liven things up a little bit. Not that you're not lively and
yeah, that's kind of a slap in the speech therapy face there. Who's Adam?
Yeah.
Yeah, he just livens up any event. That man is a hoot.
Adam, if you're watching, she means that in the most sincere, kind way. Yeah, so I know Ted was working with some people in Pakistan this morning. He's getting ready to jump on, and we will get rolling as soon as everybody. There's Ted.
Oh boy, is he going to come with like a musical entrance?
Usually he does. Let's see what happens here.
He didn't last time. I was kind of sad about that.
Yeah. Not hearing anything. Oh, there it is. There is the musical entrance we all know and love. Ted, how are you doing this morning?
Good, there. I just faded out. How was that? Was that smooth?
That was very smooth.
It was very smooth. It was almost
like skipping.
Yeah, like planned radio kind of thing. So
Splendid. I am doing a watch party, and I'm keeping my camera off for a little bit because I'm eating toast.
You're eating toast.
Well, not at the moment. I'm talking at the moment, but
is the toast have anything on it, or is it just kind of plain toast?
It has no, just plain. I'm Methodist. No flavor for me, thank you.
Do you have butter on it at least?
No, I did butter and grape jelly.
That's not plain toast. That's some saucy toast.
Yeah, that's kind of saucy.
I'm talking at the moment. Too much Chad. There we go. Okay.
Too much.
Well, because you were coming out of this computer over here and you're there on that computer.
Yeah, nobody needs that much Chad in their life.
Oh, heavens no.
There's a limit to it.
You've got to really space it out. So Katie's getting ready to jump on.
What?
Stay right there. I'll be right back.
Well, Ted, we can't see. You could have just left and we wouldn't even have known it.
Chad, also, your point about being cold isn't like helped when you're wearing a jacket in the office.
I say that is me being prepared rather than being cold.
For
And I
anyone
think if
watching,
one is prepared,
eyes
one
roll
is
away.
not cold. When one wears fancy ruffled short sleeve shirts, then
It's seasonally appropriate.
huh?
I'm going to wear my parka there to this afternoon.
Yeah, it's kind of like not summery outside right now. So
Good morning.
Good morning, Katie.
good morning,
Hey, team.
Katie. We're just talking about temperature and because that's what we talk about here.
Well, we always give our weather report before we get started in any webinar. So
Okay, do you feel like the office is too cold?
I was only there yesterday. It was a little chilly, but I was okay.
I feel like I'm getting a lot of.
Is that the wrong answer?
Your company consists of a lot of 20 to 30-year-old women, Chad. Like,
That's true. We get cold easily. Yeah, I usually bring a sweater with me everywhere I go, but I'm not used to going anywhere. So I got to the office and I was like, do I even have my computer? Do I even have, anything? So I didn't have a jacket with me.
Yeah, even Steven was giving me sass about it. So
That makes sense.
yeah.
So they'll eventually be like an office hoodie that just stays there. So
Newsflash, woman is cold.
yes. Yes.
For all this, I want to file complaints into EBCS directly care of Ted Hoke.
sadly, I don't think your HR manager can handle this one.
That's true.
That's
true.
pretty tough.
Yeah. So Ted, are you done eating your toast yet?
No, I'm still enjoying it.
Okay. Well,
You should.
I think I think we can get going with or without you eating your toast. Kate's going to monitor the Facebook comments today.
Okay.
So we're going to go ahead and get rolling. We've got Lauren Ross back. Lauren, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Lauren Ross. I'm a speech therapist with Evidence-Based Classroom Solutions, and I'm also currently working on becoming a BCBA. And so, yeah.
Just super cool with all those possible letters behind your name.
I know. I'm really excited to have all the letters.
Get them all.
It's like alphabet soup behind my
A
name.
through Z.
Actually, I don't think there's a Z.
We could try. I mean, somewhere.
It would be cool if there was some kind of Z designation.
There might be. If anyone knows in the audience, please let us know.
Yeah, what degree do you need to get a Z behind your
So
name?
we will get it.
In other countries, it's a Z.
What about a zookeeper?
True.
Like I feel like a professional zookeeper should have a Z behind their name in some way.
I don't know. We might have to ask Tiger King.
Well, Zoo.
Oh, they were on the news this morning. Did you see that?
No, what did they?
She was the woman that fed her husband to the
Carol
lion.
Baskins?
Yeah. She was officially awarded Joe Dirt's or whatever his name is. Joe, what was it? What's the
Joe Exotics?
Yeah, Joe Exotic's.
Sad that I know that off the
Zoo.
top of my head.
So she was
Most people
officially
do.
awarded his zoo.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I guess. I don't know. I haven't watched the
That's
whole
just-
season. I don't really know if it played out the way it should have, but
No, it didn't. It was a cacophony of bad.
Well, actually, I didn't finish it. I never finished it. So, sorry, world. I will, though.
I just didn't hear that guy sing that same song anymore.
Oh, the songs were
Every episode.
So let's get back to OgCom.
Oh, so yeah, let's finish introductions. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Chad Honeycutt with Evidence-Based Classroom Solutions. I'm board certified behavior analyst, licensed special education teacher. Katie.
I'm Katie. I'm a behavior specialist with the company. I am, trying to get those letters, so we'll get there soon. So
I
I
have all the letters.
want to be a BCBA. It's in the works, friends.
You're just
big
waiting
kitty.
for test
Only
centers to
big
open.
cats, just little cats, right? So,
I only have little cats because I
Yeah.
think owning big cats clearly is probably not ethical. But I do
Bailey
have,
and Birch would maybe frown
it's
upon that.
specifically stated in
I
our-
looked it up in I looked it up in our ethics Bible, the Bailey and Birch book, and I
Oh,
didn't
that
say
was
anything
before.
about big cats.
Ted, you look very fancy.
Yeah,
Thank-
you and Lauren
well-
have this like you're going out on the town tonight or something.
No, we're
why
black
wait until
today.
tonight?
What's
I go
that?
with you, Ted.
Why wait until tonight?
Yeah,
Let's
that's
go.
true. I mean, Ted's been working in Pakistan this morning, so the glory
Yep.
of online media. Ted, you want to throw your introduction out there?
Yeah, I am Theodore A. Hoke, EDD, BCBAD, LBA, LPC, LAP, CTP, IBA, and those are all real things. Because I'm making up for Katie and Lauren's lack of letters after them.
Oh,
Ouch.
Personal this morning.
Wow, the
Wow,
zippers
that-
in the
oh.
morning.
And
hey, do we
now
need to go to the hospital with those burns?
I'm going back to my toast.
Yes.
Going back to your
Third degree. Third degree.
Yeah,
Record,
all right,
Speech
so-
therapy
He
has a
shows
lot of
up,
letters
he
behind
makes
it.
mean jokes, and he leaves. And we still love him. I don't know.
So
It's emotional terrorism at best.
last week, I think this is kind of a good transition because last week we were talking about social skills, and this week we're kind of focusing on communication, specifically augmentative communication. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of opinions. I know I have opinions, but I think a really good place to start, and since we do have a licensed speech pathologist with us, who does have those Russian letters, the CCCP thing.
CCCSLP. You never get it right.
I know, but it
Gotta
always
get it
reminds
right.
me of the Soviet Union. It's CCC-SLP, and when I
Can we
look at
get
it,
the
I just
point?
see the CCCP, and
Yeah.
but
And let's
Okay. So
anyway.
what is your Russian speech therapist doing now?
So, Lauren, from the speech pathologist standpoint, let's talk about just communication. What is communication?
Communication is the act of engaging in, sharing just your intent with the world. That could be nonverbal, verbally. That can be how you engage with communication partners. And language can be broken down into a lot of different variables, expressive and receptive. Ted,
Oh no.
that's fired. Articulation.
I'm eating toast, so I'll just let you go on.
You what?
I'm eating
toast
toast,
is more
so I'll
important.
just let you go on.
You're just okay. Enjoy the toast. Voice, it can be broken. Speech therapy also looks at all these different components within it. So you're, like we discussed last week with pragmatics, it all comes together to make a total communication and how a child is communicating. And I should say total communication because that is a form of communication. But Chad, what else, do you want me to go into augmentative communication as well right now?
Well, not just yet, because you said something I kind of bumped on there, and which was it was the ABA creeping into your speech world a little bit, and the idea of it also being nonverbal. Now, Ted brought up a good point. I think we need to stick to this kind of company wide. I really like this. We need to use the word spoken language, spoken communication instead of verbal. I like that.
And non-spoken.
And non-spoken, yeah. So. But
change the last, I don't know.
one of the most
7
entertaining
days.
conversations to have with a speech pathologist is really a behavior analyst communicating that a child pointing is a request, right? Like that is verbal behavior in our world. And it's entertaining because you and I had that conversation
Yes, we
early
did.
on, and I think things flew at me. I think something might have been thrown at me during the conversation.
That's a
But,
daily occurrence when we're together.
Yeah, it's
Seen that
a normal thing.
firsthand.
But I think that is one thing when we bring in the ABA to it, the outcome, the intent is so important, and communicating that intent. So when we talk about communication as behavior analysts, we are always talking about functional communication, right?
Yes.
But I think we need to acknowledge, because we do have you, and you're an amazing speech pathologist, and
Thank you.
one of the absolute best, and that speech pathologists tend to focus more on the formal properties of speech than they necessarily do on the functional properties of speech. And that can be where sometimes we get a little conflict between ABA and speech pathology.
Yes, very much so.
Ted,
I would say that's one thing that we struggled with a lot when we first started working together was I would look at all the formal natures, like where there should be a pause, where there should be intonation, where there should be just a question, and you would like, well, it's fine, it'll work, the kid got it through.
Ted, we also have a distinction between language and verbal behavior.
Yes.
Verbal behavior is that speaking, signing, reading, writing, thinking, typing, texting, semaphore coding, all of that stuff that functions as verbal behavior. And what language is the practices of a society, practices of a community that shape and maintain that verbal behavior. So, you know, I don't know, this may surprise you. Growing up in Chicago like I did, I learned how to speak English. And my parents spoke English, and their parents didn't always speak English. But my parents spoke English, my brother spoke English, my sister spoke English, I spoke English, most of my neighbors spoke English. In school, we spoke English. But I have friends who were born in Pakistan. They grew up speaking Urdu. And my friends in China, they grew up speaking Mandarin. Now, this isn't because we're fundamentally different in some way. This isn't because we're genetically very different from each other. It's because there are different practices in place in different places and in different societies and different cultures, different groups. You know, culture itself could be defined that way, so could society.
Yeah.
But different sorts of sounds get selected out as the ones that make up that language, you know? So
Yeah.
Language is the practices that shape verbal behavior, but verbal behavior is the verbal behavior. And now I'm going back to my toast.
And we appreciate the spoken words there that got us back
well
to your
said.
toast.
Yeah.
Very, very
No,
well said.
I like how he's like a whack-a-mole of knowledge. He just like pops up and
Yeah.
displays a little bit of knowledge and then
Goes back to his toast. No, and I think what Ted hit on is certain sounds in certain languages. And I don't know for everyone listening, but we're all as a company learning Bulgarian because
We're trying.
we're trying. It's very interesting.
We have a wonderful teacher.
We do. She's fabulous. And a lot of the sounds there we're really struggling with because they are not found in our English language, and our articulators are not used to moving and producing them. And especially, I know Anastasia, our great translator in Bulgaria, she was, I forget what language she was telling us about, but they can be 4 to 5 vowels. And to string that together as an art in the US or in any English speaking country would be really challenging because our articulators are not used to producing that and moving in those motions.
Yeah. So Lauren, during our like lessons, is trying to help us figure out like where to place our tongue to make the sound happen. And we've got all these awesome, you know, very specific scientific ways to make it happen, which we're lucky to have a speech therapist while we're learning a new language as well. But
yes, I think like we do with so much in education, we kind of oversimplify communication a little bit, right? Like we just, and Ted's point's really well taken, that while we focus on verbal behavior as BCBA, there's also language, and there's formal properties of speech and functional properties of speech. And it is a broader kind of conversation, and not every child that we work with is, and this is what special education should be. It should be individualized, right? So as we kind of develop this conversation, I really want to emphasize that you need to look at that individual and decide what is going to be the most efficient and effective way for that child to communicate and interact with their environment. And I think that's where augmentative communication comes in. Ted's got his arm raised and it's cool. Ted is looking so cool. I'm so like feeling so dressed down, and I'm going to zip up my jacket a little bit just to make it a little more.
Okay, well,
I don't know if that's going to help.
But not helping. No, not helping at all, is it?
Well, behavior analysts are very concerned with typography as well. You know, the words I'm saying have to be intelligible enough. They have to be, and I need to articulate well enough so people around me know what I'm talking about. They know what I'm saying. It does me no good to ask for a drink of delicious Coke Zero, no calories, all the taste. Does me no good to ask for Coke Zero by saying, because you don't know what I want, right? I may as well just lead you out into the kitchen and wait until you pull the right thing out of the refrigerator. which my younger brother who had Down syndrome, who took a while to learn how to speak, that's what he did.
Did not
And
know
it
that.
worked, but you have to go through a lot of errors before you get to the right thing. I have to do a lot of guessing. But if you're able to shape Coke Zero from me, if you're able to get me to say that under the right circumstances, this is exactly what I'm going to get. We also want people to be able to sign cracker and get that right, because otherwise, if they do it this way, you're going to give them a tree and they won't be happy, you know? So form is very important for us too. When we're teaching verbal behavior, and the form we go after with all of our learners is the one that for that person is going to produce the most reinforcement. Over.
Yeah, you know, the Coke Zero thing, and by the way, this broadcast is brought to you by Coke Zero. What did you say? All of the calories and none of the taste, or something?
None
like
of the
that?
calories, all the taste.
None of the calories, all of the
Can we
taste.
say that? We don't mean that.
No.
I don't know. It's not official. We didn't get a check. I mean, it's not like they were money.
Coke Zero, if you would like to
Sponsor us. We're open. We can even wear like Coke Zero shirts.
Sure.
You know, we'll be like NASCAR.
Anyway.
I digress.
Sorry.
But no, I think when we're working with students in, you know, so much of our conversations always go to the self-contained special education world, but it does generalize in all settings. We are not always specific enough. We do accept drink for everything, right? And that can lead to some problems and behavior down the road. It is important to teach, like Ted was saying, topography and specificity. Specificity?
Specificity.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's hard.
All right.
That was relative, Ted.
How many EBCS employees does it take to say a word?
We just need Lauren.
You just need Lauren. Actually,
I think Chad can help too.
Yeah.
And Ted.
So I think, again, that's going to kind of drive into this conversation of augmentative communication, because one of the things that I find true about augmentative communication is that it is limited in its topography. Like, it's limited in practical specifics.
Well, Chad, can I jump in? Because you hit on something that I know is a hot button in our company.
Yes.
Core boards.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, also, have we discussed what augmentative communication is?
Yeah, let's go back there.
Take a step
Just reeled it back for those that don't understand.
Let's
the
reel it back
augcom.
Let's let the speech pathologist break down augmentative communication.
Okay, so augmentative communication is any form of communication that is not verbal communication. So this could be temporary. Yeah, spoken.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, you've got to remember, guys, I've been hearing verbal, nonverbal since I was 18.
I know, but
Yeah,
we're
30
gonna.
now.
I like the.
It's not
the
how
spoken-
behaviorists roll.
Yes, we're shaping your behavior. That and Coco.
But so any type of communication that is non-spoken. Better, Ted?
Nice.
Very good. Very good.
Okay. And so this can be for short-term usage, which would be like more temporary if someone has a stroke and they're using PECs to communicate, or a dynamic display to communicate, like an iPad or a Tobii device or a Dynavox device. This can be very short-term. This could also be long-term, which is oftentimes what we see in our classrooms being used, that we're trying to develop the long-term usage of augmentative communication. And so this could be a child working with a device or PECs, any form of that, even total communication, using mainly signs and PECs. That combination could also be used. And a big thing is also therapeutic use of augmentative communication. So helping foster and develop a child's form of communication using AAC. And AAC is augmentative.
AAC.
And
Okay.
PECs is picture exchange communication?
Correct.
Yeah, so that's when we would teach a child to exchange pictures for actual items. And,
Correct, yeah.
and it would expand.
Or actions, or yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it would expand.
And PECS usually does start out with just exchanging pictures, exchanging one thing. But I've seen it done by people who are really good at teaching it. And you have to be a great PECS teacher in order to get this to happen. I've seen it done so that the PECS user is actually able to spell out phrases with the right text and comment on things like, huh, look at that outside, things like that. It's rare that someone gets to that extent of speaking with other people using PECS. But I don't think that's any reflection on the ability or intellect of the PECS user. I think that's more dependent on the person teaching them.
Correct.
Yeah, I
I
think-
completely agree, because I feel that so PECS is broken up into 6 steps, 6 phases. And I want to say, please, hopefully no one's going to yell at me on the internet. It's either phase 2 or phase 3 that we start requesting, and that's where we stop teaching. Like phases 4 through 6 are where we're going to have those full communications, and it's not just demands and requests. But oftentimes when we see a child get to phase 3, we see like, oh, they've got it. Like, let's not work on this anymore.
And if you're stopped there, you're not making a child, you're making a cat. Because think
Yeah.
about it. All cats, any communication from a cat is either give me this or stop that, right?
Yeah.
And that's when
That
it's
we
all-
understand.
When it's all telling you I want something or quit it, that's not a conversation. And that really limits, what the person's able to get involved in their life. Got to go all the way. Got to
Okay.
get to that level 6.
Let's take 1 minute and kind of divide things up a little bit, though, because we did this when we did our training on accommodations and modifications. We were talking about the difference between low tech, high tech, assisted technology, right? So I think it's kind of important to divide the road a little bit, but with augmentative communication too, because there's a conversation about core boards, PECs, sign, and then there's a conversation about iPads,
So
the talk for me tablet type things, those kind of things. So
talk.
It's not what they're called, but
No.
it did explain
No,
it.
no, stop that.
I'm just here to monitor how we say things.
So with speech therapy, they're called static devices or dynamic devices. So static is.
you want to check with Ted and make sure that's okay first, though?
You don't have to ask me what speech stuff is called.
Chad. Okay, so static, they're not changing. Like oftentimes this is when we use Go Talk. So that's like a board of, it can be 4 up to, I've seen it up to 15. It goes higher, I think all the way to 30.
Yeah.
And so that it's not changing. When the child hits a button, nothing changes. If we get into like a Tobii device or a Dynavox, our use of an iPad with Proloquo to Go or Talk Tablet, when you hit a button, it can change and open up a whole new menu options. So like for breakfast, you hit it and it opens up all these different options. Our emotions.
Yeah,
So
I've seen some really nice, really elaborate ones like Liberators or Pathfinder devices.
Yes.
Where you have 16 keys across, 12 keys down, and a touch screen. And so you really, this is really sophisticated. The only problem I have with those, I was doing therapy with a guy before, not as a behavior analyst, but as a therapist, who used one of those. And the only problem was I would ask a question and it would take him 2 minutes to compose his response. And then he would hit talk. So I had to work really hard on remembering what it was that I asked him, because 2 minutes is a really long time when you're waiting for something. But also B, I would cheat and look at what he was typing in on his device. And he got really angry at me one time and said through his device, I don't get to see what you're thinking, so you don't get to see what I'm thinking.
that's
And
fair.
that's
And
fair
like,
to say.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I know. When I was in grad school, I worked with an aphasia group, and it was very, when we were working with devices, it was very, very strong rule. You don't look at what someone's typing until it's output.
Yeah, I don't know the etiquette. As a teacher and as a behavior specialist, especially in classrooms, I actually haven't interacted much with it. I have worked alongside a speech therapist with a child that I was also working with, who used an iPad, but to communicate. But again, it was only used in certain times of the day, which is probably a problem, I would assume. And that's mostly what I see when I go to school.
Well, that kind of
implies,
implies you have nothing to say during all those other times of the day.
yeah.
I've seen in some classrooms years ago when I worked for a big school system up here in Northern Virginia, but I won't say which one. They would do speech time during morning meeting. And what that was the teacher would say good morning to the student and then pull out the Big Mac switch, and the student would hit it and say good morning, and then the Big Mac switch goes away, and that's it for the whole day. So the kid has nothing else to say apparently the whole rest of the day.
The child's only limited to saying good morning. I think
Yeah.
as a speech therapist, that's one of my bigger pet peeves when working
Yeah.
with a child that needs an augmentative communication device. And I walk in, I'm like, oh, where's the child's device? Which technically should be glued to the child's hip.
Yes.
And they're like, oh, it's in his backpack, or he
Yeah.
left it at home, or it's not charged.
He has nothing
And
to say.
yeah,
Well,
and it's like,
and
okay, well, okay, I guess that kid's not talking today. Clearly, you don't
that
want
really
to.
speaks to the kind of subtitle of this, right? Who's doing the talking? Like if in that case that Ted just kind of gave, it wasn't the child really doing the talking. It was the teacher that gave that child one option to hit a very colorful button that
Right.
echoed good morning. You know, I think it is important. We all want communication. Don't get us wrong. The purpose of this is not to say that we don't support anything and everything that will make children communicative, but what we really focus on is level of independence. And I think that is where things kind of get lost in the interest of the child sometimes in exchange for things. You know, one of the things that Ted talked, I can't remember if it was Ted or Lauren, said that, you know, we never see kids get past stage 2 or 3 on PECs. And part of the reason is because it does become more complex. It requires more kind of sophisticated teaching. And it requires training too. I mean, I think that's a big component of it as well. But more than anything, it requires fidelity. And if the PECS is not being used at home, and if the PECS is not being used throughout the entirety of the school day, that's why we don't get past, you know, certain phases, because the consistency is not there.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
Because this is actually super interesting to me, because I actually don't know that much about augmentative communication. I haven't had the opportunity to use it too much with kids. So is it speech therapists that mainly advocate to push for using these devices and teaching people how to implement them in the classroom, or what's
So
the
I
usual?
think when we're discussing the school division, it is the IEP team. It's the a lot of the speech therapist's responsibility to determine what level of communication device the child needs. Doing a symbol assessment, or feature. Sorry, I took notes actually, so like.
Nice. Awesome. Good. I love it.
Feature matching assessment. The speech therapist definitely needs to look at that and look at the child's language. Back in 1997. So I'd have to say, like, it's been 23 years since this was published. There was a study that showed that impaired cognition doesn't preclude communication.
Okay.
And so I think that's a lot of times when parents are pushing for augmented communication devices, they're wanting these dynamic devices based off of information based on that study, saying, hey, well, we want these great dynamic devices. It showed in this study that, you know, it doesn't preclude communication, but at the same time, you need to look at all these different categories that the child's communication is, because there is a level of cognitive deficit that would impede a child's ability to use a dynamic display over a static display, and their ability, like, you just need to break down all the different components.
Cool, because as a teacher, you might not know how to use PECs appropriately, and I think that's a whole serious training.
And I think that is something that would fall on the speech therapist. Ted, I see you have your hand raised.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, and from a behavior analytics standpoint, if the child can do echoic behavior, if the child can repeat, we're going to go with speech.
Right.
If the child doesn't do echoic very well while we're working on that, if the child can do good motor imitation, particularly fine motor, we're going to go with sign while we work on the speech. If the child isn't there with either of them, then the thing to do is go with another device, a device of some kind, or with PECs, as we're working on the motor imitation and the vocal production and the echoic behavior. In addition to all that, though, there's a big difference in devices and in, verbal behavior systems between selection-based topography, or selection-based systems, and topography-based systems. Now, speaking, signing, writing, doing PECs when you get like level 5, 6, and you're actually composing things, using a liberator device or a pathfinder, those more elaborate things, that's topography-based. And there's proprioceptive feedback that comes with everything we're saying, like if you pay attention to it. If you're not paying attention, you don't feel it anymore. But we feel, some people call it muscle memory. what you're saying, kind of like when you're typing, if I type REI and I mean to type reimbursement and it comes out reinforcement and I have to correct it, you know, there's all that stuff. We do different movements for everything we have to say. Others, like the initial PECs, are selection based or using the static systems. They're selection based. And every response is this. It's pointing to something. Mm-hmm. Now, what the research shows, all other things being equal, if you go with topography based, the learner is more likely to learn it more rapidly, and it generalizes more rapidly, and you get into it enters into equivalence relations, which we're not talking about today, a whole lot more rapidly. So that's nice, but you don't always have that option because the learner's not always there yet. The thing about that what Lauren was talking about with these dynamic devices, and even the more sophisticated static ones, is that there's a lot of conditional discrimination there.
A lot, yeah.
You got to scan. You have to scan and find the thing you're going to point to and then point to it. And if you have someone who's not good at simple conditional discriminations yet, they're not going to be able to use that yet. So you got to teach the conditional discrimination simultaneously with that thing if they're not going to use it. So again, parents might want the more elaborate thing because that's a hot thing now, but the kid may not be ready for it yet. Doesn't mean they'll never be. It's just right now we got to start in a different place.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that we found, Lauren and I both ran into this, was that there's another level of discrimination that has to occur. And that is that the kid, the student has to understand that this is a tool and not a toy. And at home, if the iPad's used as a toy, it's not going to be a very effective tool in the classroom. And then, you know, the other thing for me, just kind of cycling back around a little bit, is, Katie, your question, that concept of nonverbal. You know, Ted hit on it. If a child has a coex, that's what we need to be developing. We need to be taking that and expanding their spoken language.
Yeah, I have experienced walking to classrooms where the augmentative communication device is in the backpack most of the day. And it actually, I'd worked with this kid probably 2 or 3 days. And then I actually didn't know there was an augmentative communication device. So I had just gotten the IP. I was just looking over things and I was like, oh, where is it? It's in the backpack. But the thing is, I was confused because I'd gotten language out of this child. So he had a coex. He actually had some intraverbals. And I was like, I was shocked. And then that has occurred multiple times in many classrooms. And so it's interesting because we are always going to push that spoken language first if it's available, just for independence. So.
Yes. And I think ethically that's what we need to be doing.
And do you think, could we use augmentative communication devices as like an add-on eventually to like enhance communication, or do you think that's a no-no? I'm just curious.
I always suggest it if that's something the child is used to. I wouldn't I don't know if I would use that solely. I would definitely use more of a total communication, like using PECs, using augmented, like using more of a device or sign language, as well as mainly reinforcing that verbal communication.
So that would be considered your total communication, because I've heard you say that beautiful phrase like throughout your throughout working with you. I love yeah. You
actually the first sentence she ever said to me.
Yeah, right? I associate you with it. It's great.
Yeah, it's so funny. But no, I think I can recall a situation where I was working with a pre-K and I was getting the kid to man for pushing on the swings, and he was approximating the man and he was making the appropriate sound. I mean, it was close. It wasn't great, but it was close. And the teacher interrupted me and said he needs to be using his PECS card for that. And I'm like, well, no. There's
a misunderstanding with I think especially teachers not understanding how to appropriately use or when to appropriately use it.
Yeah, I think a hard thing, and this shouldn't be placed on the teachers very often. I feel like the teachers are given these things saying, hey, you need to use these, and they're not properly supported or explained.
Right.
And so I think this is a great opportunity for us as specialists in this area to go in and say, like, well, this is when we could be using it. Maybe for this, we can work on more shaping verbal communication.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of nonverbal, I mean, the three of us, especially, I'm sure, Ted, you've got some experience with this as well, but we've had a lot of upcoming like pre-K students in the kindergarten, most with autism, most labeled nonverbal, and
Non-speaking.
well, no, they were labeled in the
They're
IEP.
labeled nonverbal,
I
but
know,
yeah,
because
but it is considered. Yeah.
And,
speaking.
you know, when we interacted with them, we were able to get 20, sometimes upwards of 50 echoic responses, appropriate echoic responses from them. That is not a nonverbal or non-speaking child. And that is not justification for, just because they haven't learned how to use that spoken word yet. They haven't learned what to do with it yet. That is not a reason to kind of just jump into the only thing that we're going to support is augmentative communication. I love the whole language approach, total language approach. I'm not a fan of it with the technology because I think it's so overly prompt. I think that does have a place, but I think when you watch it kind of being used within a school division, a lot of times it's, oh, you want something, you were sitting down to have lunch, so the IA goes over, takes out the iPad for the first time from the kid's backpack because it's been sitting there all day, walks it over to the table, takes the kid's hands, takes their finger, pushes on the chips and goes, oh, you wanted your chips, and then gives the kid the chips. Well, again, that's not the child necessarily talking. With the
So that's more of a problem with how it's used, not with the actual device.
Yeah.
And I think Lauren's right. I think this stuff kind of filters into classrooms, and I have seen teachers put augmentative communications in IEPs without speech even being present in the conversation, and that to me is a big
I
mean,
Hold on, I need to balance my world again.
I think that if it's dynamic technology, it needs to be done in coordination with the occupational therapist too, because there is motor planning that has to happen and visual perception that has to happen with the use of that device. So I think collaboratively there needs to be a large discussion. But the reality is that batteries die and devices get left at home. And if you think about it from a perspective of yourself, you're literally saying that in certain situations you're not going to have a voice because you don't have this device. If we don't support a more broad kind of efficient method of communication that doesn't require a battery or somebody remembering to bring it along, then you're really taking that child's voice away, in certain instances. And I
think that's when we start to see maladaptive behaviors. If they can't communicate what they want appropriately, if they don't have their device, if they're not given another option to communicate, it might look like grabbing or hitting.
Yeah, and I think that's when we do need to look at, even with the children that are using just a dynamic device like anything electronic, and also teaching them how to use PECs in those instances, like the battery runs out. I know, Chad, you and I worked with a student very early on, and he was using a device, but it was not always the most functional manner of using it. And so like he would just press like his favorite food constantly over and over throughout the day. And it wasn't really functional. And then like when his iPad was left at home, he didn't know how to communicate that he wanted his favorite food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think how are we building an independence and spontaneity with it if the only time, like Ted said, they have to communicate is when we present the opportunity to them.
Yeah, if the child isn't independently going to get the device and use it, we need to look at what we're doing.
Yeah, we don't do that with academics. You know, kids need to learn to read. So there are billions of reading opportunities across the day. If reading time was that one time during the day when you held up one flashcard with one word and the kids said it, and there's no other exposure to print throughout the whole rest of the day, you're not going to get very rapid reading acquisition. By the same token, we're not going to get rapid acquisition of speech or sign or PECs or using these dynamic or static devices if it's just that one opportunity a day. And with all of us, we gotta go for the system that's going to provide the most reinforcement for that person, right? The one that most people are going to be able to respond to. So when we can, we go for speech. Then we go for sign maybe, but it's good to have a backup. Like when I'm in China and I need to buy cufflinks or a tie, and I don't know, how to say those. I'll draw a picture, or I'll just do this. For some reason, I don't know that this means tie. but this means cufflinks. They lead me right to the case.
Could you like bow tie? Like,
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's cute.
isn't this the sign for bow tie?
Oh, I don't. I'm not.
I have no idea.
Plus, sign language is
But-
different in so many different places.
Oh,
like,
it is.
So it's
Yeah.
hard.
There's
but-
even dialectal differences in sign.
Really?
Yes.
You interrupted Ted's thought. He was like on a
I'm
roll.
so
No,
sorry.
I forgot because I'm old. I'm sorry. I forgot.
I'm the
Sorry,
same way, and
Ted.
I'm not like I'm sorry.
It was within
frustrated
that
with us now.
2-minute stretch. He was talking about his cufflinks.
I forgot.
Bad EBCS.
Well, Ted, when we went and picked out a lot of flowers in Bulgaria,
Yes.
you did
They were gorgeous.
a wonderful job of using nonverbal communication to
Non-spoken. Because
lots of education going into using
we wanted 7 dozen, but we wanted them broken up into groups of like 6 or 12. And she didn't understand and put them all together,
It
remember?
was huge. Just
And so
gorgeous.
then I did something like I pulled out a receipt or something and drew on the back of it like groups of like
bouquets. Yeah.
yeah, like this. Like here, I'll show you.
Yeah, and
Something like this, where that group, and a few more. And then she, oh, okay. And then she did it. And then the way she told us how many levs we owed her, because that's some money there, was she punched it in on a calculator and showed us the number. And Chad, 300 levs, $150, not that much money, get over it.
For that many flowers.
Yeah.
Not
a
really.
lot of money for flowers. I sent them out for like carnations, and they came back with the most extravagant.
Oh, but these were beautiful.
was-
And the people we were giving them to deserved it. And it was just a beautiful moment. And Lauren and Ted have fabulous pictures with
Yeah,
these
I mean,
flowers
the
also.
pictures were really totally worth $150. I mean, yeah.
Like, we should put those in the office. Like,
Ah.
yeah.
Yeah, Lauren had me back for like more than 2 minutes and said, you need to Venmo me $150. I'm like, what?
For that many flowers that are that beautiful, like, I don't know.
It's
a
That's
good
a
deal.
bargain. That's a
But
bargain.
it does kind of emphasize,
Yeah.
again, specifics. So how many, what was it, 7 dozen?
7
Seven.
dozen.
7 dozen in one bunch is different than 7 individual dozen.
Yeah.
bunches of
That
roses.
would be hard to communicate in another language. Like, that would be.
And we
Yeah.
know that a lot of maladaptive behavior, a lot of problem behavior is communication based. Like it's trying to communicate something. And
Like, who's frustrated? And that, like, everyone's frustrated when you can't communicate what you need.
so there again, I think that efficiency is such an important thing to evaluate in whether you call it fluency or efficiency. I think fluency is a good way to say it too. With last week we were talking about social interactions, and we talk about fluency in reading all the time. We talk about fluency in math, like how quickly a kid can do a math minute, that kind of thing. But when you think about it in a social interaction, if 2 kids are on the playground and one comes up to one kid and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" and it takes that kid like 3 or 4 minutes to respond, there's not likely going to be a social interaction. There's not going to be any intersecting play because the other kid's just going to kind of run off. So I think we need to keep those things in mind, that communication needs to be this very broad environmental support that we're putting in place, and we're teaching how to use it. My big with PECs is kind of like with visual schedules. I see them just thrown in front of the kids without any instruction, and they're not actually taught how to use them. They're just prompted to them over and over again. There's a difference between using prompts to teach and just prompting to get a response every time. If you're using prompts to teach, you have a plan to fade the prompts out, and you're going to leave just a response that response class that you want. But I think that's my hang up with PECs, is that we get to really just, okay, what do you want? You want your chips? Here's your chips. And we don't really move much beyond that. Or I've seen speech pathologists go in with like full sentences of PECs at the pre-K level, and the child hasn't even learned to man for the noun yet. And I'm like, well, that's really, really putting the cart before the horse here. So I just think we need to be practical. We need to be mindful of what the overall desired outcome is. And that's independence and spontaneity with language. I mean, that's what we want. I wish my teenager wasn't so independent and spontaneous with his language sometimes, but it's part of being an adult and a human. So.
Well, I think what you hit on with the PECs and the speech therapist coming in with this Mandarin strip and usually a book of like 50 PECs, it's so much we look at our end game and we don't look at all the many steps to go up that staircase.
Yeah.
So, and teaching that discrimination, I think that's one thing Ted really has hit on that needs to be done for the AAC to be effective.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a kid that can't even tact something, then probably not going to be very successful.
Thing is labeling.
Dynamic.
Yeah.
Well,
Where they're trying to sort through stuff.
Well, and you kind of have to, teach that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If the only time the kid engages in any verbal behavior is to ask for something, because those are the only opportunities you give them, or the only opportunities you attend to, it's not really a conversation.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I know we did this big webinar series, and we talked a lot several times about environment and setting up classroom environments, even in the home. I think this applies if you're working with a child with a disability or with maybe some language deficits, or speech deficits. You've got to contrive the environment to create the need to use words. If everything is always done for the student, if they don't ever have a reason to use their words, they're not going to. And it's there's a lot of different evidence-based practices that we've talked about, whether it's incidental teaching or embedding it in pivotal response, or just even man training, just setting up conditions that make it necessary for that child to use this language and giving them opportunities to practice. I think it's, with what Ted just said, especially, we don't give kids enough opportunity to practice those skills throughout the course of the day. It's kind of when we decide they're going to do it. Yeah. So Ted, I've got an interesting question for you, because you're the guy. Where should cognition fall in making decisions about directions to go for communication planning and instruction?
You mean like what do you mean cognition? Thinking or IQ or what?
Yeah, I would say, let's work with IQ. I mean, I think that's something that everybody's, and I know the limits to that, but.
Well, you have to realize that IQ tests themselves rely on a whole lot of verbal behavior and verbal responding.
Right.
And so if the person's not good at verbal behavior and speaking, and you're using a test that requires speech, you're not going to get much out of them. And I've done so many where I get an IQ of less than 38 or an IQ of less than 40, simply because the person isn't real good at speaking. Then there are the nonverbal, really non-spoken intelligence tests. Those are good to use with these folks. But the person, those sometimes rely on good conditional discrimination skills or other things. I've worked with people. There was a guy I worked with a while ago who's about my age. I worked with him when he was in his 40s. He had an extensive signing repertoire. Didn't speak. He had autism, extensive signing repertoire. He could communicate anything with sign. And if he didn't know the sign for something, he'd make a sign up, and it made sense. And when I would do this guy's psychological evaluation every 3 years, because I was required to, I wouldn't use Wechsler. I wouldn't do, Stanford Binet or anything like that, because they require a lot of speaking. I do non-spoken tests. One of them that I would do was the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test.
Yes.
Which all that is a test of single word vocabulary. So nothing more. People make more of it than they should. But with this, he was bad at that. He couldn't do it. Not because he's not bright, but because he's not good at that kind of conditional discrimination. And so he would get standard score of less than 40, age equivalent of 1 year, 9 months, because that's the lowest you can get. My guys needed a raw score of at least 94 or 93, depending on whether it's Form A or Form B, to get something other than standard score of less than 40. Most of my guys couldn't, because they weren't that good at conditional discrimination. So first thing, if you're relying on IQ or other tests like that, sometimes they're good. Sometimes they just aren't really good measures of what the person can do. Because, they're developed to be sold, to be used with a good amount of people, right? And you're not going to develop something that is only useful with this much of the population.
Right.
So a lot of our guys just aren't good test participants. Second, though, a lot of what you see on testing because you're not permitted to reinforce or to shape stuff during testing, you see stuff that, like, if you could give a second chance or a third chance and you could reinforce approximations, you may actually see the behavior there. You may see some learning, but that's not testing under standard conditions. So you're not going to do that. What's nice about the VB map, which is not an intelligence test, but it is a verbal behavior assessment. What's nice about that is you're encouraged to reinforce while you're doing it, and the ABLES too. And with the VB map, you can get multiple attempts on things. And so, you know, what's nice about that, particularly the early echoic skills assessment. And so there it's okay to shape stuff, because what we're looking at there is the extent to which a child can rapidly learn this stuff. We're not only looking at what he can do right now, but the extent to which he can rapidly learn it. So cognition, I say not as useful as the child's vocal production, the child's ability to echo, child's ability to imitate, and child's ability to follow instructions. I would go more on that than anything else.
So I think that's kind of where I was hoping you'd take us down. You did kind of presented it so elegantly and really broke it down.
That's better.
Well, yeah, I think it is. I think that especially when we talk about IEPs too often, we love those plops, right? We love those little numbers that we can put in present levels. And a lot of times we use these standardized forms to measure measurability with certain kids, but not all kids fit into those boxes. We've had this conversation recently about reading and measuring like reading ability with kids with autism. You know, there's not really a good PALS or DRAs, things like that. They don't do a good job of evaluating actual reading levels because they don't really take into consideration the motivation to read or lack thereof, maybe. What I find interesting about where Ted got to, and I was kind of hoping he would, is that I think it's so important that school divisions start focusing on, especially with these adaptive and functional classrooms, verbal behavior and verbal operant behavior, and looking at things like the VB map. I know, Lauren, when you and I were still teaching, or you speech pathologist and I was still teaching, and when Katie was teaching, we had kind of shifted to where you were looking at all your learners kind of collaboratively with us through the VB map lens.
Yeah.
And that does give us this broader perspective of what the child actually can do and where they're at.
Right.
And it gives us a really good baseline and also trajectory too, I think.
Yeah, it helps. It helps drive instruction. Like, on
yeah,
a
it
daily
definitely.
basis. Yeah.
I felt that when we started collaborating with that and goal writing, we saw a lot of development of verbal or
There's
spoken,
growth. Yeah, it
spoken
happened
language. Yeah.
fast. Yeah. It was very cool. And I felt more supported. I felt like I knew what I was doing more. And, you know, it's more reinforcing for the teacher to work in that kind of collaborative way and using a verbal behavior assessment. It was cool.
And I think for speech therapy, we often look at, like, we obviously want to give tests like the OWLS, or we want to give the TOLD P, or all these great norm reference tests. However, there aren't those, if we do give them, oftentimes they're not great depictors of our children's or students' language. And I've had times where I have a child who's very verbal, very, I'm going to say verbal for that time. I'm not going to take that one back. We're going to keep with that. But
Well, you should.
You what?
Well, you should.
Okay.
Take it back. Not say
No, but that she's able to, as a child, she's able to communicate in class. She's able to do all this great social communication. However, when it came down to taking a test, she was not able to look at it because it looked at inferencing and looking at, I'm trying to break down all the different parts of the TOLD P, but there was all these different aspects that she just wasn't strong at. And what her parents were upset with the score that she got, but when I did a functional communication assessment, it showed how well she was able to do. So I think breaking down, I think speech therapy, we definitely need to look at developing more functional assessments.
Yeah, especially for our learners in those adaptive classrooms, right? I mean, cycling kind of back around to with the functional language and the VB map thing, when we go into classrooms, when we go into school divisions and conversations I have with SPED directors, this is the group of students that teachers find the most challenging, the ones that haven't figured out how to use the language they haven't figured out maybe where that student is developmentally from a spoken perspective. And the VB map really does a good job of framing that and gives those teachers a support mechanism and a plan. And I think that is where conversations need to open up a lot in school divisions and in IEPs. It's really funny. I can remember when I first started working in a school, I heard a lot about VB map. It was done really, really bad. Like reflecting back on it, like how it was presented, it was like this little piecemeal thing. And now that I have a better understanding of it, I'm like, wow, that's amazing. But it was talked about a lot, and then it just seemed to kind of drop off around here in this area. And then when we started pushing in the schools, we would bring it up. There's like, yeah, we have some, we don't really do much with it. But it really is a good and useful tool to supplement what you're doing in your classrooms. And there is no kind of secret that parents are not only asking for, but in a lot of cases demanding ABA, applied behavior analysis, for working with not only students with autism, but students with intellectual disabilities, emotional disabilities. And VB map just covers that. It delivers that if it's done correctly and it's done under, when your staff is trained to do it. It really, to me, is a good trajectory of a way to go with it. But I am interested sometimes, like I think I understand what you're saying, Ted, about the IQ, and I totally agree with you. And I've seen that as well. Sometimes I think we ask too much. Like when I look at some goals of learners from a communication standpoint, when maybe they do have like a ceiling of vocabulary that they can acquire.
I don't know though. I've with all the adults I've worked with, adults with intellectual disability and autism, and all the testing I've done with them, there have been quite a few who don't test out very well, who come out with IQ less than 38 or less than 40, and not PPVT standard score of less than 40, all of that, and yet you can carry on a conversation with them, and they make sense. There was one guy who I worked with who was 34 years old, had Down syndrome. He wanted to learn how to read. So I started teaching him how to read. We were doing phonetics and whole words, using the Dolch word list for the whole words, and the Dr. Seuss books, because there's so much repetition of sounds. And he went from like in a couple months, grade 0, like nothing, to first grade level, which was nice, and he was happy with that. And then I left that job because it was awful. But I think that the whole IQ thing is just not a good indicator. And again, because the way that it's arrived at, it's great for lots of uses. But what we're talking about is skill acquisition and rate of learning and things of that sort, which you can only really assess by actually assessing rate of learning and skill acquisition, like we do on the verbal behavior assessments. And that's not a slam against the psychological tests or the speech and language tests, because you do have to follow standard procedure to administer them, because if you deviate, then those norms tables in the back and everything else you have to do to come up with the scores, it's all invalid.
Yeah.
You just can't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the reading thing, because when I was teaching, and Katie, you're in your classrooms kind of this echoed into it a little bit. We used literacy to develop communication. I think, and Lauren, I'm thinking back to when we first met in that very first classroom.
Tiny classroom. That was
and
very
I brought up books, not like books, but really started focusing on literacy, and that drove out a lot of communication, because they were making the sounds repeatedly. They were making the words repeatedly, even though it was a choic reading or choral reading.
Right.
they were having the opportunities to use the words. And what we saw was this huge kind of growth from it. And I think sometimes we limit our vision. We get tunnel vision with students that maybe aren't as outspoken, if that works, for Ted, when they come in at the kindergarten, first grade level, and we don't present that stuff kind of with fidelity and repetitively, because it really can be a good tool to teach communication as well. I think it ties really well into speech and verbal behavior, and again, kind of everybody working together and collaboratively.
Well, I know we're kind of running out of time. I worked with this teacher this year, and he would read for all his lessons. Like his group would always do like short readings, and it would be the same for the week. And I remember one time we had an administrator come in, and so all they're doing is reading. They're not learning. They're not like practicing anything. It's like, well,
whoa,
there's a lot that's being taught in the reading. And
we're still learning. What?
Yeah, it's like, and by the end of the week, it was really neat to see the language acquisition, because the kids were using the words, and it was really cool to see that develop.
Very cool.
Yeah. So yeah, we are running out of time, but I think what would be cool for Thursday as we pick this up is maybe talk about like a planning procedure, like kind of identifying what the best practices are now. And evaluating from the speech perspective, you're sitting in that IEP from the educational perspective, and Ted's all those letters after his name's perspective, and his cat's perspective. I haven't seen the cat in your lap in a while, Ted.
No, the dogs usually won't let her in the room, but they're all sleeping right now.
And it's actually a really cool picture, because when the cat opens its eyes, all you can see is the green eyes against your black shirt. It's pretty cool.
Ted has a glowing shirt.
Yeah, so let's we've kind of gotten to this system where we really just kind of go at the topic on Tuesday, and then talk about best practice and how to really apply it in the classroom and IEPs and school settings on Thursdays. So that'll be fun to kind of come back with. Unfortunately, Lauren, you won't be with us, but I think we can try to.
I'm now debating if I want to like bring my computer on vacation with me.
I want you to enjoy your vacation, but you bring so much to these.
Yeah, I might. Let me think about it. I think it'd be fun, because I've got a lot of like process development for assessing children with augmented communication devices. So
yeah, I think it's such an important topic in education, especially with our adaptive and our functional learners. But also, one of the things and maybe we can talk about this a little bit on Thursday too, is also our learners with emotional disabilities. I mean, that you see regressive kind of patterns of speech and almost developmental delays, like kind of hitting certain developmental walls with language if there's trauma in their background and things like that as well. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit on Thursday. And until then, thanks everybody for tuning in.
Yay. Thank you
Thanks,
guys.
Love ya. Bye.
Bye.
All right, guys, watch the Tiger King. We'll talk.
I gotta finish it.
We'll touch up on Thursday with that.
Take care. Have a great week.
Bye.
Bye.